Imagine living in a world where punishment wasn't just about serving time. It was about losing a part of yourself, quite literally. Medieval Europe, an era where justice was swift, brutal, and horrifyingly creative. Among the most shocking forms of punishment was castration, a practice that stripped individuals of more than just their physical abilities. It robbed them of their identity and dignity. But castration wasn't always a punishment. It served many roles as a tool for maintaining power, an act of religious devotion, and even as a bizarre solution to preserve purity. Castration, as a concept, predates the medieval era, with its roots in ancient civilizations. In the Assyrian and Persian empires, castrated men, or eunuchs, were often employed in royal courts. Stripped of the ability to form families, eunuchs were seen as loyal servants with no competing allegiances. As Christianity spread across Europe during the medieval period, the practice took on new dimensions. The Church, paradoxically, condemned bodily mutilation as a violation of God's creation, while simultaneously using castration as a way to enforce moral discipline. For instance, castration was occasionally seen as a form of penance. Some even chose it voluntarily to avoid the sins of the flesh. Additionally, the medieval justice system embraced castration as a punishment for crimes deemed morally corrupt, such as adultery or sodomy. The act wasn't just about physical mutilation. It was a public statement, a way to shame offenders and showcase the consequences of defying both divine and secular laws. Castration also played a role in power dynamics. In certain courts, particularly in 1873, the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs held positions of immense influence, shaping the course of history despite their physical emasculation. The origins of castration in medieval Europe weren't just rooted in punishment, but were deeply tied to power control and the moral codes of the time. In medieval Europe, justice wasn't just about rehabilitation. It was about setting an example. Castration emerged as a severe punishment, particularly for crimes that society deemed unforgivable. Adultery, sodomy, and even treason were among the offenses that could lead to this grim fate. One infamous case is that of Peter Abelard, a prominent 12th century philosopher and theologian. Abelard fell in love with his student Eloise, sparking a scandal that enraged her family. Her relatives took matters into their own hands by having him forcibly castrated. This act not only punished Abelard, but publicly humiliated him, effectively ending his career as a cleric. Castration was also used as a deterrent. Public punishment served as a warning to others, reinforcing the consequences of stepping out of line. Crowds would gather in town squares, watching with morbid fascination as offenders were subjected to this brutal form of justice. The spectacle was meant to instill fear of divine wrath, societal judgment, and the physical agony of the act itself. But it wasn't just about physical pain. Castration was deeply symbolic. It wasn't merely a punishment for the body. It was a way to strip a person of their masculinity, power, and social standing. For many, the aftermath was worse than the act itself. The shame and ostracism they faced could last a lifetime. Castration wasn't limited to criminal punishment. It also became a weapon in political and dynastic struggles. In the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs were a central part of the royal court. Stripped of the ability to form their own families, eunuchs were seen as loyal to their rulers, making them ideal candidates for administrative roles. These castrated men often held positions of immense influence, acting as advisors, generals, and even regents. Their unique position in society, lacking heirs or personal ambitions, made them trustworthy in the eyes of kings and emperors. Some eunuchs, like Narses, a Byzantine general, rose to extraordinary power, commanding armies and shaping empires despite their physical emasculation. However, castration wasn't always voluntary. Rival heirs to the throne or political enemies were often forcibly castrated to eliminate their claims to power. This method was seen as a merciful alternative to execution, as it allowed the individual to live, albeit in a diminished and humiliated state. For example, Byzantine Emperor Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, reportedly used castration to neutralize threats to his rule. By removing the ability of his rivals to produce heirs, he ensured his own dynasty's survival. Castration as a political tool revealed the lengths to which rulers would go to consolidate power. It wasn't just about physical dominance. It was about psychological control, turning potential threats into submissive servants. Castration in medieval Europe was not only a form of punishment or political control, it was also intricately tied to religious beliefs. In the Christian worldview of the time, bodily purity was deeply associated with spiritual holiness, and the idea of purging sin through physical suffering was common. Castration, in some cases, was seen as a way of achieving spiritual purity or even martyrdom. Some medieval figures went as far as voluntarily undergoing castration, believing it would free them from the temptations of the flesh. One of the most infamous examples is that of Origen, an early Christian theologian in the 3rd century, who in an attempt to follow the teachings of Christ to the letter, castrated himself to avoid sexual temptation. Though the Church later condemned such extreme acts, it highlighted how some believed that physical suffering and bodily mutilation could atone for sin. In the Renaissance period, the Church's stance on castration evolved into something more ritualistic and institutionalized with the rise of the castrati and sacred music. These were boys castrated before puberty to preserve their soprano or alto voices into adulthood. They became central figures in church choirs, their voices revered as divine and angelic. This was not about punishment, but about preserving purity, both spiritual and vocal. While the idea of bodily mutilation to secure divine favor or purify one's soul may seem extreme, it reveals how the medieval church intertwined spiritual devotion with physical sacrifice, often blurring the lines between penance and personal ambition. Castration, once a punishment, became a pathway to religious distinction and honor, albeit in a twisted and controversial form. For those who survived, the effects were lifelong. Castrated men or eunuchs suffered not only from the physical trauma, but also from the hormonal imbalances that resulted from the loss of testosterone. In many cases, castrated individuals were seen as less than human, either as objects of pity or fear. Eunuchs in royal courts or religious settings may have gained some prestige, but for most, the result was isolation and shame. Castration marked the end of a normal life. As the Renaissance dawned, attitudes toward punishment and bodily mutilation began to shift. The rise of humanism, with its emphasis on individual dignity and the sanctity of the human body, led to a gradual phasing out of castration as both a punishment and a political tool. Slowly, governments and religious authorities started to move away from these extreme forms of justice. Despite this decline, traces of medieval practices lingered in certain areas, particularly in the use of castrati in church music, which persisted into the 18th century. Yet, as attitudes toward the human body became more compassionate, castration began to be viewed less as a moral or political tool and more as a barbaric relic of a bygone era. By the 19th century, the practice had virtually disappeared in Europe, replaced by more progressive legal and social norms.